My name is Isolda. I'm 31 now, but the words that tried to bury me were spoken when I was 13. I grew up in Grand Junction, Colorado, a town that calls itself quiet, proud, and decent. Like those words mean the same thing as safe. My father was a local mechanic. My mother worked at the public library. We lived in a single-story home with beige siding and wind chimes that never stopped moving. I was the only child. Maybe that's why the silence hit harder when it started. Was born with a rare condition that clouded the cornea of my right eye, glaucoma. The doctors said I'd never see from it, and they were right. As I grew older, the eye stayed pale, colorless, and unsettling, or so people said. On top of that, a birthmark bloomed across the right side of my face and shoulder, dark and sprawling, like a shadow no light could erase. When I was a child, I thought it made me look like a warrior, but school taught me otherwise. It didn't take long before I became that girl, the one kids whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening, the one teachers hesitated to put at the front of the room. I had learned to live with the looks, the flinches, the second glances. I told myself stories to survive, stories where I was a character in disguise, touched by magic, waiting to reveal her power. But stories don't protect you when adults decide you're a problem. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day that starts with burnt toast and a forgotten homework assignment. I remember the tension in the kitchen. My mum's lipstick too bright, my dad tying his shoes like he was trying to delay something. They told me there was a special meeting at school and that I didn't need to come. I wasn't surprised. The principal, Mr. Keller, had been watching me differently ever since a classmate's mother complained. Her son had cried after sitting next to me during art class, saying my eye made him feel sick. That meeting broke something I didn't know had edges. Mr. Keller sat across from my parents and used a voice that sounded soft but felt like a slap. He said my appearance was distracting, that I was unsettling to other students, that children had reported distress. Then he said the line that would echo in every room I entered for years to come. Children with faces like mine were psychologically harmful to their peers. Not different, not unique, harmful. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. I saw it in my mother's eyes when she came home, refusing to meet mine. I heard it in my father's voice when he told me we'd be trying something new with school. The next morning, my schedule changed. I was pulled out of group activities, then from assemblies, then from in-person classes altogether. They called it an individual learning plan, but what it really was exile. No one said the word, but everyone acted like they understood, like they agreed, as if my face, this face I had no say in, was a threat that needed to be managed. A flaw so disruptive it couldn't sit quietly at a desk like the others. My presence had become a problem the school wanted to erase without writing it down. I stopped being a student and started being a cautionary tale. There were no goodbyes from classmates, no teachers calling to check in, just an email about digital coursework and a brown box of textbooks delivered to our porch. My mother told the neighbors I had health issues. She said it like a shield, but I could see the fear in her. Not of me, of what I reminded her of, that the world doesn't always love its children, that some wounds aren't born in flesh, but in the gaze of others. I spent that winter inside, curtains drawn, laptop open, lessons on screens with no faces. I watched my reflection flicker in the dark monitor and wondered how something so still could make people feel so afraid. I wanted to disappear, not out of self-pity, but because I thought it might make things easier. I wrote letters I never sent. I rehearsed conversations I'd never have. I imagined scraping my skin clean of the marks it carried, just to be let back into a room, just to hear my name announced without apology. But silence has a sharpness of its own. And sometimes, when you sit in it long enough, something inside starts to sharpen too. Not with rage, with clarity. I didn't know it yet, but something was beginning to rise in me. Something slow, something patient, something that wouldn't just survive, but remember every word, every silence, every face that looked away, and one day it would speak. It didn't happen all at once. They didn't strip me of my seat in the classroom the same day that meeting happened. No letter came home saying, "You're not welcome anymore." It was quieter than that, more surgical. The kind of removal that pretends it's doing you a favor. It began with small things. First, they told my parents it might be better if I didn't attend assemblies. Too much stimulation, too many people. Then they said group projects were proving logistically difficult. Soon, I was completing entire units from home. Told it was part of a flexible accommodation plan. The language was soft, wrapped in concern, designed to sound like care. But I knew what it was. I was being extracted, quietly, to protect others from having to look at me. They framed it as protection, mine and theirs. They said things like, "It's in everyone's best interest," and "This way, she'll be more comfortable." But I was never uncomfortable. They were, and that difference mattered. The day they officially switched me to remote learning, I was told over a phone call I wasn't even invited to be part of. My mother answered the landline in the kitchen, spoke in hushed tones, and then walked into the living room with her face pale and tired. She didn't even sit down. She just looked at me with that expression people wear when they're about to lie but want it to feel gentle. She told me it was only temporary, that the school was just trying to figure out the best way forward, that we could try this for a little while. But we both knew the truth. No one ever intended for me to return. My desk at home became my new world. A folding table in the corner of my bedroom, facing the wall. I logged into classes where my camera stayed off, where no one said my name. Teachers moved through lessons as if I were a ghost, a silent dot on a virtual screen. I submitted my assignments early, overcompensating for the distance, trying to be perfect in the only way I was now allowed. There were no classmates, no hallways, no lockers, no laughter, just the sound of my own breathing between lessons and the feeling of being locked inside a body that everyone had decided was too much to be seen. I watched from a distance as the school moved on without me. Pep rallies, spirit days, performances. Photos uploaded to the school's website with the caption, "All of us together," but I was never there. I stopped checking after a while. It hurt too much to see a world that had so easily cut me out, smiling like nothing had changed. And maybe for them, it hadn't. I was a quiet removal. A soft deletion, like a smudge wiped off glass. There were rumors. I heard them through texts, through the mouths of people who still wanted to feel connected to me, without standing too close. Some said I had a medical condition. Others said I'd moved away. One girl messaged me to ask if it was true I wore an eye patch now to keep people from freaking out. I didn't answer. I didn't need to feed the myth. I was already the monster in someone's story. Why not let them write the ending? My parents tried to help, in their own way. My mother bought curtains for my bedroom in a soft lavender, said it would make the space feel more like mine. My father installed stronger Wi-Fi, as if buffering was the thing that might break me. They didn't know how to fix it. They still called it a transition, not a removal. They clung to the illusion that this was just a phase, that eventually the school would come around. But there's no path back from erasure when no one wants to admit it happened. My identity began to fold into the silence. I stopped wearing earrings, stopped brushing my hair with care, stopped looking in mirrors altogether. When there's no one to see you, you begin to vanish from yourself. I stopped answering calls. I stopped raising my hand in virtual class. I became a checkbox to be marked present, nothing more. I wondered if that was the plan all along, to make me so quiet, so small, that eventually even I would agree I didn't belong. They didn't need to expel me. They just made sure I would never want to come back. One afternoon, about a month into remote classes, a teacher forgot I was logged in. She read the attendance list aloud, skipped my name entirely, and kept going. That moment stayed with me. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even intentional. But it was a clear signal. I had become invisible. They had moved on, and I was a leftover, detail they no longer needed to account for. The worst part wasn't the exile. It was the compliance. I let it happen. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I nodded, smiled when spoken to, kept my voice soft. I was so afraid of confirming their fears, that I was difficult, disruptive, dangerous, that I did everything I could to seem easy to forget. But forgetting isn't the same as healing. It's just a slower death. I began writing in a notebook, at night, not schoolwork, not essays, just words. Sentences that didn't need to be graded. Thoughts I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about what it felt like to be erased, what it meant to have a face that others feared. I wrote the word threat over and over until it stopped sounding real, until it became mine. I didn't know then that those words would eventually find their way to more than just paper, that they would one day be spoken aloud, not by the people who silenced me, but by me. And when I spoke, it wouldn't be from the back row or behind a screen. It would be center stage, with lights, with volume, with a name no one would forget. Graduation came like a shadow. I knew it was on the calendar, knew the date, the time, the names of the students walking across the stage. I had seen the photos, smiling faces in crisp gowns, teachers rehearsing speeches, rows of chairs set up on the football field. I had even received the invitation, generic and polite, with my name printed at the bottom like a technicality. But no one called to ask if I'd attend. No one offered a gown, a seat, a walk. It was clear I was meant to watch, not participate, and so I did. In silence, from the dark. The room I sat in was small, the same one I had done my last 2 years of school in. The curtains were drawn, not to keep the sun out, but to keep the world from looking in. I sat on my bed, cross-legged, with the school's live stream open on my laptop. There were no decorations, no cap, no dress, just the hum of the computer fan and the flickering faces of people who had once shared classrooms with me, now sharing something I wasn't invited to be part of. The ceremony opened with music I remembered from past years, something classical and hollow. The camera panned over the crowd, parents waving, teachers in robes, students with cords draped across their shoulders, like symbols of survival. My name wasn't listed among the honors. I didn't expect it to be. I had completed all my work, passed all my exams. But when you disappear from the building, you disappear from the story. They had erased me from the narrative so thoroughly that I doubted anyone in that crowd remembered I existed. I waited for my name, anyway, not out of hope, but habit. I sat through every speech, every call, every round of applause, bracing for the moment my name might slip out by accident, that someone might remember. But when the roll of graduates began, and the names were read aloud one by one, mine was never spoken. The list skipped from someone I once sat next to in biology to someone who had never even looked at me. No pause, no space, No silence in my honor. I had never worn a dress to a school dance, never made a speech, never stood on a stage. This was the last thing, the final page in a book I had been written out of since the day the principal decided my face was a danger. I watched them throw their caps into the air with shaky, excited hands. I watched their families cry, hug, take photos against the makeshift banner near the field. I watched the live chat fill with hearts and exclamation marks and inside jokes. I no longer understood. And then I closed the window. The screen went black, and the room was darker than before. I didn't cry. The tears had already happened, months ago, in the quiet ways you don't tell people about, in the moments between online classes, and the long gaps of silence when no one called. In the ache of being invisible for so long that you start to wonder if you ever really existed in their world. I looked down at my hands, bare and still, and imagined what it would have felt like to hold that diploma, even if just for a moment, not because I needed the paper, but because I wanted to be seen doing it. I wanted to be acknowledged, wanted proof that I had survived the same system, even if it had tried to eject me halfway through. I thought about the photo wall they had set up outside the gym. The year before, it had been filled with Polaroids of the graduating class, snapshots, from childhood to senior year, little captions written in marker. I had turned mine in, a carefully chosen picture, where my hair covered most of the mark on my cheek, and the cloudy eye wasn't so visible. But when someone posted a photo of the wall online, I searched and searched, and my picture wasn't there. They hadn't just forgotten me, they had removed me, as if I was something embarrassing in the margins, as if acknowledging me would poison the celebration. They had done exactly what they had promised my parents years ago. They kept the experience safe for the others. That night, I folded the invitation and slid it into the back of my notebook. I didn't throw it away. I wanted to remember how silence is packaged, how exclusion wears the face of professionalism, how cruelty can be dressed in ceremony. I didn't speak to anyone from school again, not a text, not a call. My number remained the same, but no one used it. My absence had become part of the fabric, normal, unspoken, like a desk that had always been empty. But I was still here, still breathing in that dark room, still holding every word they hadn't said. And though they didn't know it yet, I was writing every memory, every omission, every face that looked past mine. I was writing not to be seen by them, but to reclaim myself from the story they had denied me, and one day, I would make sure my name was not just heard, but remembered. We were standing in the checkout line when it happened. A normal afternoon, one of those unremarkable errands meant to pass unnoticed, the kind of day you wear your hair down and keep your head low, not because you're hiding, but because blending in has become second nature. The grocery store was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums under fluorescent lights and stale air. My mother had a basket full of necessities: milk, cereal, a small bouquet of white flowers she would place in the kitchen window, like hope pretending to be decoration. I stood beside her, holding a loaf of bread and a small bag of rice. I remember it so clearly, what I was wearing, how heavy the air felt, the way the cashier's eyes darted to my face, and then immediately back down, as if by accident. That was the moment my mother shifted. It was small, barely a movement. Her hand touched my elbow, light but firm, and she leaned slightly toward me. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just murmured the words, carefully chosen, soft like they might go unnoticed. She asked me to stand behind her, just so it doesn't make the cashier uncomfortable. She didn't say it in anger. There was no harshness in her tone, but it hit harder than any cruelty ever could. It wasn't the request. It was the fear behind it, the fear that my face, my skin, my eye would create a moment of awkwardness, that I would become the reason someone shifted uncomfortably in their uniform and stopped making eye contact, that I would be too much again, too visible, too raw. So I moved, quietly. I took a step back and stood behind her, the bread and rice still in my hands, as if nothing had happened. The cashier didn't say anything. He finished scanning the items, muttered the total, and my mother paid. The entire interaction took less than a minute, but in my body, it stretched into eternity. We walked out into the parking lot in silence. She didn't mention it again, and I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I had already lived enough of these moments to understand their shape. My mother, for all her good intentions, had internalized the language of shame. Not loudly, not cruelly, but intimately. She wanted to protect me, yes, but more than that, she wanted to shield the world from the discomfort of having to see me. She had carried that fear for years. It showed in the way she picked out clothes for me as a child. Nothing too bright, nothing too tight, nothing that showed the right side of my face. It showed in the way she always positioned herself between me and strangers. In every polite smile, she offered on my behalf. In every apology, she never said aloud. After the grocery store, I went into the bathroom and looked at myself for a long time. I studied the skin that curled and discolored across my cheek and jaw, the clouded eye that stared back with its milky stillness. I pressed my fingers into the scar on my forehead and traced it like a word I couldn't pronounce. I wasn't angry at her. That would have been easier. I was tired of being the one who had to understand everyone else's discomfort before they understood mine. I thought back to other times. The woman at the shoe store who kept glancing at my face while pretending to look at my feet. The man at the movie theater who turned to whisper something to his girlfriend when I sat beside him. The little boy in the restaurant who pointed and asked if I was wearing a Halloween mask in the middle of May. I remembered my mother's hands in each of those moments, calm, collected, redirecting, smoothing over the ripples, and me, always learning to shrink without making noise. That day in the store wasn't the first time I'd been asked to step back, but it was the first time I realized how deeply silence had rooted itself into my life, how I had absorbed it, willingly, thinking it was love. I had become fluent in disappearing. I knew how to fold myself into the background, how to hold a smile just long enough to be non-threatening, how to be in the room without demanding to be in it. And yet, I never stopped wanting the opposite. I wanted to stand in front of someone and not have them look away. I wanted to speak without measuring every word against someone else's comfort. I wanted to take up space without apology, without shame, without a mother's gentle hand guiding me out of the spotlight. That night, I sat in my room and wrote about the incident. I didn't name her. I didn't need to. It wasn't about blame. It was about recognition, about naming the quiet violence of always being a bit too much. I wrote the word uncomfortable over and over until it blurred on the page, until it lost its meaning, until it no longer sounded like a reason to hide. I began to understand something I hadn't before. That shame doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the voice of someone you love. Sometimes it asks you to move, just a little, just for a moment, just to make things easier. And before you know it, you're always standing behind someone, waiting to be allowed back into your own life. But I had started to change. Something in me was shifting. Slowly, painfully. The kind of shift you don't notice until it anchors in your bones. The part of me that had always stepped back was starting to lean forward, and soon, I would stop moving to protect other people's peace. I would stop apologizing for being the one they didn't want to look at, because I had seen myself, and I was done hiding. It started with one sentence. I didn't know where it came from, or why it appeared that night, but I opened my notebook and wrote it down like it had been waiting for me. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the pen, but the words didn't. They came steady, sure, and sharp. The sentence was simple. They taught me to be ashamed of a body I never chose. After that, the rest poured out like floodwater breaking past a dam. I wrote until my wrist ached, until the page was smeared. With ink and fingerprints, I wrote as if speaking would make it real, as if I could finally name the things I had been forced to swallow. I wrote about the silence in classrooms, the skipped name on graduation night, the look in my mother's eyes when she asked me to step back in line. I wrote about how people's gazes felt like bruises. I wrote about the shame that didn't belong to me, but had been draped over my shoulders like an inheritance. It clung to me, not because I invited it, but because the world kept handing it to me, gently, like a gift wrapped in care, saying, "Just hold this, just for a while." And I did, for years. Writing gave me permission to feel what I hadn't dared to speak. It gave shape to the ache I had carried since childhood, to the way I had learned to measure my worth by how invisible I could be. I wrote about my face, how I had trained myself not to look too long in mirrors, how I had learned to smile just enough to appear okay without ever letting it reach my eyes. I wrote about my body, not in metaphors, but in texture and memory. I wrote about the skin that had been called damaged, the eye that was declared disturbing, the birthmark that was described like a stain instead of a part of me. At first, it was just for me, just ink and paper, but soon the pages piled up, notebooks filled, Word documents multiplied, and I realized I wasn't writing just to survive. I was writing to understand, to reclaim, to unearth the truth buried under years of politeness, avoidance, and well-meaning cruelty. Some nights I wrote in the dark, lit only by the glow of my laptop screen, my fingers racing over the keyboard like they had their own language. Other times, I wrote in the morning when the world was still quiet and I could hear the sound of my own breath between thoughts. There were days I cried without knowing why, words ripping out of me faster than I could contain them. And there were days I stared at the page for hours, unable to find anything worth saying, my chest hollow, my throat locked. But I kept going, because the more I wrote, the more I saw myself, not as a mistake, but as someone who had been shaped by fire. Yes, but also by survival, by resistance, by the refusal to disappear. Every page became a small rebellion, every paragraph, a step away from the shame that had been stitched into my skin. Eventually, I began to wonder if others felt this too, if there were more of us, walking through the world with eyes turned down, hearts pressed flat against ribs, bodies held like secrets. So I started to share, carefully at first, just a few paragraphs, a single post. I created a blog under a name that wasn't mine, not because I was hiding, but because I needed a safe space to test the echo. And the echo came, quiet at first, then louder. Comments, messages, emails from strangers who saw themselves in my words. Some had scars, others had none. Some had been burnt. Some had simply been erased in quieter ways. But all of them had stories, and they began to share them with me like offerings, like open wounds saying, "See, me too." Those stories wrapped around mine like threads in a tapestry I hadn't known I was weaving. And slowly, I realized I wasn't alone, that my shame, though carefully assigned and deeply internalized, was not born in me. It had been planted, watered, and fed by a world that feared difference more than pain. I wasn't writing about my body because it was broken. I was writing because it was evidence. Evidence that beauty doesn't owe anyone comfort. That presence is power. That survival isn't passive. The writing changed something in me. Not overnight, not with a single essay, but gradually, sentence by sentence. The girl who once stood behind her mother in the checkout line began to step forward. The girl who watched her graduation from a dark bedroom began to speak her own name again. I was not healed, but I was becoming. I was not fearless, but I was beginning to understand that fear wasn't a reason to stay quiet. There was still pain, still the sting of memory, still moments when I walked past a mirror and saw the flash of what had been taken from me. But now I had language. Now I had proof that I could take what they gave me, shame, silence, exclusion, and make something that lived outside of their control. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a mistake. I felt like a voice. It began with an email. The subject line was simple, almost forgettable. Your blog post on educational exclusion. I nearly deleted it, thinking it was just another automated message or a generic response from a platform I'd forgotten I submitted to. But something made me click. Maybe it was the timing. Late evening, the air still, the kind of silence that makes you more open to the impossible. The sender was an editor at a well-known federal publication. She said she had read one of my pieces, the one where I wrote about being removed from school for the sake of others' comfort. She said the story had stopped her, that she read it twice, that she hadn't been able to forget it. She asked if I would be willing to expand it, turn it into a full article, tell the story from beginning to end, not anonymously this time, but in my name, with my voice, with my photo. When I read the words, "Your face on the cover," I felt something in my chest tighten, then stretch. I closed my laptop without replying. Not because I didn't want it, but because I did, and that terrified me. I spent the night pacing, hands cold, thoughts tangled. My mind was loud with voices, all of them old. The principal's quiet condemnation, my mother's worried whispers, the boy at the restaurant, the cashier with the flinching eyes. I thought about the time I was cropped out of the school's group photo, the time a parent moved her child away from me at the bus stop. I thought about all the ways I'd learned to be invisible, even while craving the opposite. But I also thought about the words I'd written, about how they had started to form something bigger than me, about the messages from readers who said they felt seen, about the girl who wrote that she read my blog in secret during lunch so she could feel less alone. I thought about what it would have meant to have a face like mine on a page when I was 12, something real, something unedited, something powerful. So I said yes. The writing process was brutal, not because the words wouldn't come, they came like a flood, but because of what they carried. Every paragraph was a door I had to reopen, every sentence a memory I had folded away for survival. I wrote about the meeting I never attended, where my fate was decided without my presence. I wrote about the graduation I watched from a dark room, the curtain pulled shut like a final act. I wrote about the fear in my mother's voice when she asked me to step back in line. I wrote about the years of not being called on, not being seen, not being asked, and I wrote about reclaiming my voice. When I sent the final draft, I felt like I had handed over a part of my skin, raw, trembling, exposed. The editor's response came quickly. She said it was powerful, honest, that it needed to be seen by everyone, not just tucked away in a quiet corner of the internet. She asked if I would be willing to do a photo shoot. Something real, she said. Nothing airbrushed, nothing posed, just you. I agreed. The shoot happened in a small studio downtown. The photographer was kind, quiet, professional. She didn't direct much. Just asked me to stand in front of a pale grey wall and breathe. I didn't wear makeup. I didn't hide the right side of my face. My hair was pulled back. I wore a simple black shirt. The lens stared straight at me. And for the first time in my life, I stared right back. A few weeks later, the issue came out. I didn't know the exact date, but I found out when my phone started buzzing non-stop. Friends from college, old neighbors, distant cousins, people I hadn't heard from in years. Screenshots, headlines, my face on newsstands, in inboxes, on timelines. The caption read, "When they said I was a distraction, they meant they didn't know how to look at me." I walked to the nearest store and bought a copy. My hands were shaking. I stood outside the building in the sunlight, holding the magazine like it might disappear if I blinked too long. And there I was, right on the cover, my face unfiltered, my eye cloudy and still, my skin marked and uneven, not softened, not explained, just there. I brought it home and laid it on the table like a trophy no one else had the right to touch. My mother found it before I had the chance to tell her. She stared at it for a long time, her hands frozen in mid-motion. She didn't say much, just looked, and I let her. Because this wasn't for apology. It wasn't for permission. It was a declaration. For weeks after, I received messages from teachers, journalists, even activists. Some thanked me. Some shared their own scars. Some challenged the system that allowed my story to happen. There was a shift, however small. A conversation that couldn't be ignored anymore. Not when it had a face. But most importantly, something shifted in me. I wasn't just writing to escape anymore. I was writing to confront, to stand in the spaces I was once pushed out of and claim them. To say, you can't erase what refuses to be silent. And now there was proof. On glossy paper, on bookshelves, on the lips of people who used to look away. My face, my words, my truth. And this time, no one asked me to stand in the back. The invitation arrived in an email with a subject line that made my stomach tighten. Panel on Equity in Education, National Broadcast. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I read it 3 times, expecting to find some detail that would explain why it had landed in my inbox. But the message was clear. They had read my article, followed the wave of discussions it sparked, and wanted me to join a live broadcast. It would be part of a televised forum, hosted by a major news network, focused on systemic bias, student exclusion, and the hidden violence of institutional decisions. The producer said I would be one of 4 guests. She listed their names casually, and there it was, his name, my former principal. I sat motionless for several minutes, rereading that single line, confirmed guest, Thomas Keller, retired, former administrator. His name didn't just stir memory, it cracked something open. I could see the curve of his mouth as he spoke to my parents. In that meeting, I was never allowed to attend. I could feel the air in the hallway outside the principal's office, stale and cold. As I waited unknowingly for my sentence, I remembered the exact phrasing my mother brought home like a wound, psychologically harmful to others. And now, a decade later, they wanted us in the same room, not a classroom, not a courtroom, a studio, lights, cameras, live. I almost declined. My hands hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. Part of me felt like that 13-year-old girl again, still waiting in silence for someone to say my name without flinching. But another part of me, a part I had spent years writing into existence. Refused to be quiet. I had waited too long, buried too much, swallowed too many apologies that were never offered. This wasn't just a chance to speak. It was a reckoning. I said yes. The day of the broadcast, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to anchor myself. Black suit, no makeup, hair pulled back, no distractions. I wanted every inch of me to be undeniable. I took the train to the studio in silence, the rhythm of the tracks syncing with my pulse. When I arrived, I was led through a narrow hallway and into a makeup room. The lights were too bright, the chairs too soft. Someone powdered my forehead. Another adjusted the collar of my blazer. I stared at myself in the mirror. The same eye I had been told would terrify people, now framed by lights and reflection. I looked calm, but I felt like a storm. When they brought me to the studio, I saw him already seated. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older, of course, and slightly hunched. His hair was grayer, but the face was the same. Stern, composed, clinical. He glanced at me when I entered, just once. It wasn't recognition. It was calculation. I nodded at him but said nothing. We were seated across from each other at a curved glass table, cameras pointed at us from every angle. The host, a polished woman with practiced warmth, introduced the segment. She recited the statistics: rising dropout rates among disabled students, lack of accommodations, the psychological toll of exclusion. She referenced my article, quoted a few lines, then turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I began to speak. My voice was steady, measured. I didn't raise it. I didn't tremble. I talked about being removed from school without being asked, about the loneliness of remote learning forced upon me, not for my benefit, but for others' comfort, about the graduation I watched from my bedroom, the photo, wall I never appeared on. I talked about silence, the institutional kind, the kind that doesn't bruise, but erases. I didn't mention his name. I didn't need to. He was sitting right there. When she turned to him, something in the air shifted. He cleared his throat before speaking, adjusted his tie, glanced sideways as if looking for an exit. He said he didn't remember the exact meeting, that there had been many students with many needs, that decisions were always made with the best interest of the majority in mind. He said the word majority twice. Then came the moment the host asked him directly if he remembered me, my full name. I watched him blink, once, twice. His jaw moved, but no sound came. He glanced down at his notes, then back up. The silence stretched. Live TV does not forgive silence. The host gently repeated the question. He opened his mouth and said my name. It came out shaky, thin, like a memory he didn't want to claim. He looked at me after that. Really looked. Not with authority, not with dismissal, but with something else. Something almost like fear. I thanked him, not for the apology he never gave, but for saying my name, because this time it was mine. The segment ended. The lights dimmed. The crew scattered. He stood up quickly, gathering his things, but paused as if debating whether to say something. He didn't. He just nodded slightly and walked off set. I remained seated. I breathed, deeply, slowly. The cameras were off, but I stayed in place, letting the silence settle, letting the room feel the shape of my presence. I had taken up space. Unapologetically, undeniably, I had been erased once, but not this time, not ever again. After the broadcast, I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even speak for a while. I walked out of the studio into the heavy dusk, the air warm against my face, the streets buzzing with a world that had no idea what had just happened inside that building. My name had been spoken on national television by a man who once insisted I be removed for the comfort of others. And it had broken something in him, not because he said it, but because he had to. Because I was sitting there, across from him, no longer 13, no longer waiting. And when I said his name, firm, clear, unshaken, it wasn't an attack. It was a reclaiming, a declaration that I remembered everything, and I was no longer afraid of it. I took the long way home. I needed the movement. The rhythm of the sidewalk under my shoes helped settle the chaos, still humming in my chest. I passed bookstores, cafes, couples walking hand in hand, people on their phones, the city unaware that history had just shifted for me in a way that could never be undone. I wasn't thinking about the ratings or the comments or the headlines that might follow. I was thinking about the girl I used to be, the one who sat in the back of the room, hoping no one would stare, the one who watched her classmates toss their caps into the air from the other side of a screen, the one who thought the only way to survive was to vanish. I went home to a small apartment with mismatched furniture and a desk covered in drafts and notebooks. I poured a glass of water and sat down in front of my laptop, still open to the article that had started it all. The headline looked different now, less like a wound, more like a badge. The page had thousands of comments, messages from strangers, former students, teachers, parents. Some offered apologies. Others simply said, "Thank you." I read them all, slowly, as if each one stitched back a piece of something I hadn't known was still broken. The next morning, I woke to sunlight on my face and a voicemail from a school district in another state. They were creating a training series on inclusive education and wanted to use my article as required reading. They wanted to know if I would be willing to speak to a room full of educators, not just about my story, but about how to change the system that made it possible. I stared at the screen for a long time, then pressed play again, just to hear it. My name, spoken with respect. No tremble, no hesitation. Over the following weeks, more invitations came. Conferences, podcasts, panels. I traveled to places I had never imagined I would be welcome in. I stood in front of crowded auditoriums and told my story, not as a victim, but as a survivor who refused to be reduced to pity. I spoke not to punish, but to prevent, to carve open a space where no child would ever again be made to feel like their existence was a disruption. There was power in that, in standing fully in the light after so many years in the corners, in wearing my face, my scars, my voice without apology. I started to see mirrors differently, not as threats, but as witnesses. I no longer checked for flaws. I looked for presence, proof that I was still here, still building something that could not be undone. One night, after a lecture, a teenage girl came up to me. Her right eye was cloudy, just like mine. Her hand trembled as she reached for the copy of my article I had signed. She didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Her eyes were wide and wet, and I knew what she was telling me. I had been her, once, and now she had seen a future in a body that looked like hers. We hugged, and I held on just long enough to let her know she was real, that she belonged. When I walked back to my hotel that night, I whispered my own name aloud into the wind. Not for show, not for validation, just to hear it, just to feel it land without shame in the space around me. It didn't tremble. It didn't ask permission. It stood. I think about that moment in the studio often. The way his mouth stumbled around my name, the pause, the crack in his voice, and then the stillness after I said his. No anger, just truth, just the echo of a voice that had waited 10 years to rise without fear. That was the real victory. Not that I made him uncomfortable, but that I no longer was.